In America, the truth doesn't just travel fast. Sometimes it explodes. Sometimes it kills. And sometimes it buries the people you love most. Baltimore County, Maryland. A quiet suburb where the streets are lined with tidy lawns, cars glint in the early morning sun, and the smell of coffee drifts through windows like a gentle warning. On the surface, it's ordinary, predictable, safe. But appearances are liars, and today they would lie harder than anyone could imagine. The Wright family lived here. Daniel Wright, a principal at a local high school, was a man people trusted without question. His reputation wasn't earned in whispers, it was carved out in years of late-night lesson planning, mentoring students who nobody else thought could succeed, and walking the halls like he owned nothing except his integrity. People liked him. Students loved him. Even parents who complained about grades couldn't find a single fault they could pin on him. Miriam Wright, his wife, worked at a nearby hospital. Calm and composed, the kind of person who smiled at strangers in elevators and made them feel safer for a moment. She didn't just treat patients, she treated their fear, their anxiety, and their lives like fragile glass. At home, she poured the same care into her family, masking her exhaustion behind warm breakfasts and gentle reminders that life would be okay. And then there was Ishmael. 16 years old, quiet, always in the background. You'd pass him in a hallway and think nothing of him. A small boy with oversized glasses, a slouch, and a mouth that rarely spoke. But that calm, unassuming exterior? It was a lie. A lie the size of the universe. Ishmael Wright had a brain that didn't just think differently. It saw the world differently. It cataloged everything. Names, faces, patterns, the slightest twitch in a hand, a hesitation in a sentence. The boy could remember every single thing he ever saw or heard. He could calculate impossible probabilities in seconds. He could solve problems in ways adults didn't even understand existed. And yet, at 16 he was invisible. This is the part of the story that nobody tells you at the start. The quiet ones are the ones who remember everything. And sometimes the quiet ones are the ones who never forget. But none of that mattered that morning. Because on this morning the Wright family's world was about to explode. Not slowly. Not quietly. Not in whispers. It started with a knock. One knock on the door. That knock should have been ordinary, the kind of thing you ignore. But this knock carried something different. Tension. Urgency. An invisible weight that pressed against the ribs of anyone who heard it. By the time the Wrights answered, the storm had already begun. Not a literal storm, though Maryland's skies can turn gray and heavy without warning, but a storm of information. A storm that didn't wait for people to be ready. A storm that struck at the heart of trust, family, and the fragile illusion that good people are safe. Evan Cross existed somewhere beyond their quiet suburb. He was a journalist, or at least that's what he called himself. Some said investigative journalist. Others said predator. What he was, in reality, was a man addicted to attention, a hunter who didn't hunt animals. He hunted stories, scandals, and reputations. And he had a singular rule: the bigger the shock, the higher the click. The bigger the heartbreak, the more viral the fame. Cross had spent months searching for his next target, combing through school board records, local politics, and even personal social media profiles. He was methodical, clever, and utterly ruthless. And when he found Daniel Wright, he saw everything he wanted. A man too respected to be questioned, too calm to be cautious, and too human to survive what was coming. At precisely 8:07 a.m., the first piece went live. On screens across Maryland, and eventually across the country, the headline screamed like a gunshot. Beloved principal caught in bribery scandal. Students and parents betrayed. No one verified the facts. No one checked the source. It didn't matter. Cross had built a perfect narrative. One that looked real. Felt real. Played on every instinct people have about morality, authority, and the rarest human commodity of all, trust. Within minutes, the Wright house became a pressure cooker. Calls flooded in. Emails lit up. Messages from concerned neighbors, friends, and even strangers. Some were gentle, tentative, and worried. Most were accusatory. Suspicious. Angry. Fearful. Daniel, the man who had taught hundreds of teenagers to hold themselves to high standards, who had stayed up all night to craft lesson plans and counsel students in crisis, felt his stomach drop. He read the article. He saw the fabricated evidence of bribes, falsified grades, and misused school funds. Each claim was a knife. Each accusation was a hammer striking metal over and over until his very core shook. Miriam found him pale and trembling in the kitchen. She tried to reach him, tried to tell him it would be okay. But even her voice, soft, careful, nurturing, couldn't reach him. Because sometimes the world moves too fast. Sometimes lies hit too hard. And sometimes, even the strongest men are powerless against a viral storm. Ishmael watched it all. His mind wasn't racing with panic, wasn't screaming for answers. He observed. He catalogued. The way Evan Cross structured his lies. The way the world responded without checking. The ease with which reputations were shredded. The fragility of trust. The patterns weren't lost on him. He noted the weak spots, the emotional flinches, and the cracks in composure. Every moment, every micro-expression was data. The collapse was immediate. By midday, Daniel was suspended. Media vans lined the street outside their home. Cameras pointed like predators at every window. Neighbors he'd waved to for years crossed the street to avoid him. The calls didn't stop. The emails didn't stop. The posts on social media multiplied like wildfire. A hashtag guilty principle. Hashtag Baltimore betrayal. Every share, every click, every retweet was another brick in a wall closing in around the rights. Daniel's first panic attack came just after lunch. He clutched his chest, gasping for air as the reality of the viral accusations crashed down on him. Miriam couldn't help him. No one could. Ishmael, standing silently behind the kitchen counter, felt nothing but clarity. He knew two things at 16 that most adults never learn. 1. People lie for attention, not for truth. 2. Memory is power, but observation is survival. That evening, the local news picked up Evan Cross's story and amplified it. Beloved principal under investigation. Families demand answers. The words echoed in the Wrights' empty living room as if the walls themselves were mocking them. By the next morning, Daniel Wright was dead. A stroke brought him down, fueled by stress, fear, and betrayal. And when the headline hit again, now reading, Principal accused dies amid scandal, the world barely paused. Few read beyond the clickbait. Few questioned the timing. Few thought to wonder about the boy who watched it all unfold in silence. Ishmael's world didn't end that day. It changed. And in that change, a vow was born. A vow so sharp, so precise, that it could cut through the very foundations of lies. At the funeral, Ishmael stood over the casket. The sun filtered weakly through gray clouds. Faces blurred. Murmurs echoed. And he whispered a promise that would shape the next decade of his life. One day, the world will know what you did to him. One day, you will beg me for mercy. It was not a threat. It was a contract. Signed in silence. Witnessed by nobody. But understood by everything. Because the world doesn't just forget. The quiet ones remember. The invisible ones plan. And the ones who never speak, sometimes roar the loudest. And this story? This story had just begun. The day after Daniel Wright died, Baltimore County felt heavier. The air was thick with whispers, rumors, and a kind of shame that settles over communities when a scandal becomes viral. People didn't just question Daniel anymore, they questioned the Wright family. Miriam's gentle presence became a target of pity and suspicion. Neighbors who once waved from their driveways now crossed the street. The flowers and cards sent to the house felt hollow, a performative sympathy that carried an invisible accusation. They deserved it. Ishmael moved through it all like a ghost. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't lash out. He simply observed. Every look, every sideways glance, every muted whisper. He catalogued it. Each one was data. Each one was a piece of the pattern that had brought his father down. He saw the mechanics of fear, of manipulation, of mass perception. He saw how one man's narrative could bend an entire town toward judgment. Evan Cross didn't rest. For him, Daniel Wright's death wasn't a tragedy. It was content. He leaned back in his chair in his Washington office, a smirk forming as he scrolled through notifications. Every share, every click, every comment and outrage was fuel. The algorithm rewarded him. His reputation soared while the Wright family crumbled. For Evan, the story had no moral boundaries. Only results. Only virality. Only the sensation of watching the world react to what he had built. Ishmael, 16 and too young to vote, understood something most adults would never admit. The system is not just broken. It's designed to fail the people who deserve it most. And the very same system that cheered for Evan's storytelling would celebrate Daniel Wright's demise without a second thought. It started small at first. Ishmael pored over his father's files, organizing them with precision. School budgets, student records, emails, phone logs, everything. He noticed patterns and minor discrepancies that Evan had fabricated and exaggerated. He traced the flow of information, how one misleading headline became a social media tsunami and how casual speculation evolved into truth overnight. He mapped it all silently, methodically, as if the tragedy itself were a puzzle to solve. In his bedroom, Ishmael constructed a mental hierarchy of culpability. Evan Cross sat at the top, but it wasn't just one man. Editors, producers, politicians, and anonymous donors all played roles in the orchestration of lies. The truth was a fragile thing and the guilty knew it. They could bury it easily. And the world? The world didn't care enough to dig. By week's end, Miriam had sunk into herself. She floated through rooms like a shadow, her once commanding presence reduced to whispered conversations with neighbors and hesitant nods to strangers. She didn't realize that Ishmael, the boy she thought fragile, was beginning to transform. He wasn't angry in the way people expected. He was calculating, patient, focused. Every tear she shed and every whispered judgment he witnessed added another brick to the foundation of the plan forming quietly in his mind. The pattern revealed itself to him in sharp, precise detail. People believed what they wanted to believe, and they believed it faster when someone smart told them it was true. Authority, however fake, was magnetic. Charisma, even when toxic, was infectious. And the world, hungering for sensationalism, never paused to check the facts. Ishmael saw it all, internalized it all, and realized that if he wanted justice, he could not fight the storm directly. Storms destroy anyone who confronts them head-on. He would have to become invisible. He would have to become a storm of his own making, silent, calculated, and unstoppable. The first time Ishmael whispered the word revenge, it was not out of spite. It was clinical, precise. He didn't want chaos. He wanted correction. He wanted exposure. He wanted the truth to land in a way that could never be ignored again. School became irrelevant. Friends no longer mattered. Every teacher, every student, every adult in his orbit was a background detail. Ishmael existed now only in relation to the plan. And yet, despite the focus, he retained a facade, quiet, awkward, harmless. People ignored him. They underestimated him. That invisibility was power. And power, when wielded correctly, could dismantle systems far larger than a single family's heartbreak. The first step was observation. Ishmael followed Evan Cross across digital and real-world trails. He memorized patterns. The journalist's morning routines, the timing of his posts, and the way he framed stories for maximum outrage. Ishmael noted the words Evan used to manipulate emotions, the moments he forced pauses for dramatic effect, and the calculated public apologies when one lie was exposed. Every detail was a weapon. Every habit is a clue. But there was another layer. Ishmael knew that fighting only with intelligence wasn't enough. Invisibility demanded more than observation. It demanded a mask, a performance. And that performance would be subtle. It would be so convincing that even those closest to him could not see through it. He began to practice. Alone at first. Stuttering. Mispronouncing words. Fumbling with objects. Asking questions that seemed painfully obvious. Each misstep was intentional, rehearsed, and calibrated. To the world, Ishmael became the harmless, slow-moving teenager, the kind of boy people would never suspect. A boy who posed no threat. A boy who would be forgotten in a crowd. Yet beneath the surface, his mind worked faster than anyone could follow. While he tripped over shoelaces and spilled pencils on the floor, he cataloged the world in minute detail. The color of Evan's tie on a Tuesday morning, the cadence of a producer's laugh, the sequence of posts that triggered virality. Every observation was filed, tagged, and indexed. Every mistake in his act strengthened the illusion. Meanwhile, Baltimore whispered. Social media never slept. Commenters argued and judged. Opinion pieces analyzed Daniel Wright's legacy with clinical detachment, as if a man's death were data to parse. Parents spoke in hushed tones in PTA meetings, never suspecting the boy who moved quietly through the chaos was the one who saw everything clearly. Miriam noticed the change in him, though she didn't understand it. There was a new focus, a new intensity behind the quiet eyes. She chalked it up to grief, to trauma, to the burden of loss. She didn't know that Ishmael's grief was neither fleeting nor passive. It was action disguised as stillness. And that stillness was dangerous. By the end of the second week, Ishmael had drawn the first schematic of his plan. Not on paper. Not in a notebook. In his mind, flawless and unbreakable. The goal was simple: dismantle the machine that destroyed his father piece by piece without being seen. But simplicity in design belied the complexity of execution. You would need patience, precision, deception so thorough it could fool the very architects of the lies. And then came the first test. A minor headline, another exposé from Evan Cross, targeting a local teacher with fabricated accusations. Ishmael watched as the teacher's career crumbled in hours. Parents called. Students cried. Emails poured in. Social media exploded. And in that moment, Ishmael felt a strange combination of rage and clarity. This wasn't just about his father. This wasn't just personal. This was systemic. He whispered to himself, almost as if the words were a spell. You destroy families for clicks. I will destroy your illusion of safety. I will dismantle everything you think protects you. And I will do it quietly, invisibly, perfectly. At 16 he realized something adults rarely admit. Revenge is not a single act. Revenge is a process. It is strategy. It is patience. And patience, when wielded correctly, can become unstoppable. Ishmael began the next phase of observation. Beyond Evan, beyond the family, beyond the immediate outrage. He traced the digital footprints, the social media shares, and the cascading reposts that carried lies farther than their origin. He mapped the connections between newsrooms, producers, PR firms, and politicians. He noted every weak link, every complacent ally, and every opportunity for leverage. By the end of the month, Ishmael knew something frightening. The system wasn't just flawed, it was optimized for predators like Evan Cross. It rewarded manipulation, amplified lies, and crushed anyone too honest or too kind to fight back. And he understood something else. In order to fight a machine this powerful, he had to become one of the ghosts operating beneath it. Invisible, underestimated, and perfectly hidden in plain sight. That was the moment Ishmael made a silent vow to himself. Not just a promise to avenge his father, but a commitment to understanding the system completely, mastering it completely, and then, when the time was right, using it against the very people who thought themselves untouchable. And for the first time since Daniel's death, Ishmael felt alive. Because he was no longer a victim. He was a planner. He was a strategist. He was the quiet storm forming just out of sight. Ishmael didn't step outside often, but when he did, the world reacted exactly as he expected. People ignored him. Adults didn't see him. Kids mocked him quietly, assuming he didn't notice. He wore oversized hoodies, scuffed sneakers, and glasses that were slightly askew, everything chosen carefully to signal harmlessness and insignificance. Every stumble, every hesitant word, and every awkward pause was intentional. He became the perfect nobody. It was astonishing how effective it was. Teachers overlooked him. Store clerks barely acknowledged him. Even classmates who once exchanged casual hellos walked past without a glance. Invisibility was intoxicating, and Ishmael used it like armor. Every glance he caught, every snippet of conversation he overheard, became fuel for the plan. One afternoon, he followed Evan Cross's digital shadow with surgical precision. Not physically, he stayed home, but online, in forums, comments, posts, and microblogs, he mapped patterns like a cartographer of human deception. He noticed Evan's rhythm, the times he posted for maximum outrage, the hashtags he recycled to manipulate virality, and the subtle wording in headlines designed to spark panic. One missed comma here, one ambiguous sentence there, enough for a careful observer to predict and intercept the chaos before it spread. Ishmael cataloged it all. And then there were the people Evan destroyed without anyone noticing. Families like his own. Teachers, store owners, and parents who trusted a journalist more than their own gut. Their lives crumbled in silence, only visible to the algorithms that amplified Cross's every post. Ishmael studied these tragedies. He memorized names, dates, social media posts, and even the exact phrases Evan used to manipulate emotions. Every piece of data became a weapon. Every overlooked detail is an opportunity. But observation alone wasn't enough. To understand the predator fully, Ishmael had to move closer. He had to see how Evan operated in the real world. So he began a subtle infiltration. First, the smallest steps, delivering coffee orders to journalists near Evan's office, running errands that left him unnoticed but present. Every small errand gave him insight into routines, habits, and weaknesses. Every unnoticed glance toward Evan was a lesson in timing, body language, and human behavior. The Wright family's tragedy fueled more than just observation. It sharpened Ishmael's mind to a razor edge. He didn't just want revenge, he wanted exposure, understanding, and inevitability. If Evan thought he could manipulate reality for clicks, Ishmael would manipulate him into revealing the truth without even knowing it. It wasn't long before he tested the first layer of his fool persona publicly. At the corner store, he deliberately asked questions that made the cashier roll their eyes. At the library, he fumbled books, dropping one in front of a patron and apologizing in a clumsy, hesitant voice. Every awkward step reinforced the mask. The world classified him as harmless. He was the background noise nobody paid attention to, and that was exactly the point. Ishmael's precision extended to timing. Every movement, every deliberate mistake, was executed with intent. He studied the microseconds it took someone to judge him and the subtle expressions that revealed disdain, impatience, or underestimation. Those milliseconds were gold. They revealed human behavior stripped bare. And in those glimpses, Ishmael plotted his eventual advantage. Even his mother, absorbed in grief and panic, didn't suspect the transformation. Miriam's attention was consumed by daily survival, the flood of messages, the endless questions from concerned neighbors, and the quiet humiliation of watching the world misjudge her husband's life. Ishmael moved through this world unnoticed, and in that invisibility, he honed the first stages of a plan that would span years. Then came the first opportunity to see Evan in person. A local fundraiser, a school board meeting, or something minor but public. Ishmael arrived, blending into the crowd. He watched. Every gesture, every glance, every calculated smile from Evan was analyzed. The journalist had no idea a boy barely noticed by the world was reading him like an open book. Ishmael memorized the cadence of his speech, the timing of his pauses, and the subtle manipulations of audience perception. It was mesmerizing. Evan was a machine built to deceive. Every action, every word, carefully measured to create outrage and attention. Ishmael cataloged them all in his mind, storing patterns like code. It was as though he were not just observing a person but mapping a complex algorithm of human influence. And in that mapping he found a flaw. One tiny, almost invisible flaw, but enough to exploit later. Back home, Ishmael began translating observation into strategy. He sketched mental maps of influence, connecting dots between journalists, editors, and politicians. He identified the weak points in the network. He studied timing, the cadence of virality, and how rumors mutated into truth with terrifying speed. Every misstep he noticed in Evan's patterns became a potential lever. And every overlooked family destroyed by Cross's narratives became motivation. By now, Ishmael's private routine was intense. Hours of observation, note-taking, mental rehearsal, and testing his fool persona. He trained himself in the art of invisibility, slipping past adults, moving through crowds unnoticed, and speaking when necessary but only to draw attention away from his awareness. The quiet boy became a shadow with eyes like a scalpel. And yet, beneath the performance, he felt the first stirrings of anger that were more than mere grief. Anger directed at the injustice of his father's death, yes, but also at the entire ecosystem of manipulation. The news cycle, social media algorithms, and political opportunists, all of them are complicit in amplifying lies without pause. That realization shifted Ishmael's perspective. He wasn't just fighting one man. He was preparing to confront a machine. School became secondary. Teachers noticed his silence, but not in any meaningful way. Friends assumed he was withdrawn. Social media barely registered him. He existed as background radiation, unnoticed but observing everything. And in this invisibility, Ishmael began creating mental contingencies. Every potential interference, every unexpected variable accounted for. Everything and everyone was data, potential leverage, or a threat to be cataloged. At night, he revisited his father's files. Budget sheets, emails, schedules, phone logs, every fragment of Daniel Wright's life he could access. Each document revealed something about the patterns of attention, manipulation, and influence in their world. The more he studied, the clearer the mechanism became. Lies spread faster than truth because lies were entertaining and truth required work. People consumed deception willingly, and they trusted those who wielded it convincingly. Ishmael's first journal, written in coded shorthand only he could read, became a manifesto of observation. Pages filled with notes, hypotheses, and mental experiments. How long before a viral story reached the local news? How many social shares before people believed it? How many family reputations were destroyed before accountability arrived? He calculated probabilities, charted timelines, and built a mental map of the machinery behind public perception. One evening, as the sun set over Baltimore, Ishmael whispered to himself, not out of anger but as affirmation, "I will become the thing nobody sees. I will move through this world unseen. I will watch, I will wait, and when the time comes, the storm will be mine to unleash." And in that moment something fundamental shifted. Ishmael Wright was no longer just a grieving boy. He was an architect in training, a strategist, a mind that had begun to convert loss into leverage. Invisibility became power. Observation became weaponized intelligence. And patience became a superpower. He tested it immediately. Over the next week he moved among adults, classmates, and store clerks with an intensity that would have been imperceptible to anyone. Every question asked, every action performed, was a calculated illusion. And every small revelation, every tiny slip he caught in others, reinforced the network of knowledge he was building. Baltimore had stopped being a home. It had become a battlefield of judgment, rumor, and digital outrage. Every street corner, every grocery store, and every social media feed seemed to whisper the same accusation: the Wrights were guilty. They had been consumed, and the flames of virality were relentless. Miriam struggled to maintain appearances, but appearances had become meaningless. Calls from neighbors, once polite, now carried an edge of suspicion. The well-meaning advice from strangers online disguised cruelty as concern. Every day she received messages on social media, threats, warnings, and accusations. The digital mob didn't care about innocence or grief. It only cared about clicks. And in this she was powerless. Ishmael moved through this chaos like a specter. He didn't intervene, didn't plead, and didn't fight. Instead, he observed with brutal clarity. Every misplaced look, every hesitant whisper, every social media post became a note in a growing ledger of human behavior. People were predictable. So predictable, in fact, that even a tragedy of this magnitude could be mapped, analyzed, and eventually exploited. The local news covered Daniel's death with a tone of casual detachment, as if mortality itself were just another bullet point in a story. Anchors repeated Evan Cross's accusations without hesitation. Clips from his videos looped on every screen, each frame reinforcing the lie that had destroyed a man's life. Ishmael cataloged every image, every inflection, and every carefully chosen pause. This was not news. This was manipulation, performance, and exploitation intertwined into a machine too large for any single person to stop, except him. In the shadows of their grief, Ishmael noticed something that would define the next phase of his existence. The people around him underestimated him. Adults assumed he didn't understand. Friends thought he was lost in sorrow. Even Miriam, desperate and exhausted, assumed his quiet meant weakness. And that was exactly the advantage he needed. He began experimenting with minor acts of deception and small tests of influence and observation. He asked questions that seemed naive, allowed people to underestimate his awareness, and then recorded mental notes of their responses. Every assumption, every micro-expression, and every casual dismissal was data. Every adult who laughed at his apparent simplicity became unwittingly complicit in his education. One afternoon he shadowed a local event tied to the school board. Officials discussed upcoming initiatives, unaware that Ishmael was quietly observing patterns in human behavior. How authority figures reinforced each other, how lies could be introduced subtly, and how groupthink could override conscience. He memorized the names of everyone in the room, their habitual gestures, and the way they spoke when they thought no one was watching. It was during this period that he understood a critical truth. The system didn't just enable Evan Cross. It depended on him. Without him, virality falters. Without manipulation, social media collapses into inertia. He wasn't fighting one man. He was learning the rules of the machine that devoured families, careers, and reputations without remorse. Meanwhile, the public fallout accelerated. A fabricated story about the Wrights' finances began to circulate among local media. Headlines screamed accusations that were both absurd and terrifyingly specific. Teachers whispered in hallways. Parents withdrew children from Daniel's programs. The police received anonymous tips based on nothing more than Evan's manipulations. Every lie gained momentum. Every click reinforced the power structure that Ishmael now understood with surgical precision. At home, Miriam's health began to deteriorate. She slept poorly, skipped meals, and spoke less. The grief that had once been raw and overwhelming became chronic and numbing. Ishmael watched silently, noting her routines, her habits, and her vulnerabilities. Not out of malice. Not yet. But to understand the human toll of lies was to understand how the system could be dismantled. To know the damage was to know the stakes. By this point, Ishmael had made a decision. He would not confront Evan Cross directly. He would not call authorities or attempt any public reckoning. The world would dismiss him if he tried. Instead, he would build a plan that no one could anticipate, leveraging invisibility, intelligence, and patience. He would learn everything. Every habit, every pattern, every weakness. And he would wait for the right moment. The boy who once stumbled over his own shoelaces now moved with precision, even in public spaces. Every misstep was calculated, every awkward pause intentional. He had become a ghost walking among the living, unnoticed yet hyper-aware. Adults assumed he was grieving, classmates assumed he was foolish, and the system assumed he was irrelevant. And that invisibility became his greatest weapon. One evening, Ishmael sat at his desk and began constructing mental timelines. The events leading to his father's death, the viral cascade that destroyed their family, and the social, political, and technological mechanisms that had amplified it. Every misstep by Evan, every exploited weakness, and every viral spike was a lesson. He memorized it all. He visualized sequences. He predicted reactions. By the end of the night, he had mapped out what would later become the blueprint for infiltration. He also recognized the moral battlefield. This wasn't just a personal vendetta. The system that enabled Evan's lies affected hundreds, maybe thousands. Innocent families ruined, careers destroyed, trust shattered. The fight he was preparing for would not be simple. It would not be about anger. It would be about precision, strategy, and timing. Revenge was a plan, not a feeling. Ishmael began to rehearse his public persona relentlessly. At school, he asked intentionally dumb questions, misread instructions, and fumbled assignments. Every day he perfected the illusion of mediocrity. Teachers and peers laughed or ignored him. Adults assumed he was overwhelmed by grief. Everyone underestimated him, and everyone underestimated him perfectly. The next step was exposure. Learning the people around Evan Cross and understanding the inner workings of the operation that destroyed his father. He began paying attention to online forums, news release schedules, and social media engagement metrics. He traced the chain of influence that allowed a single lie to spread across platforms, building momentum beyond the control of any one journalist. He saw the invisible infrastructure supporting deception. Editors, producers, interns, and algorithms all conspiring to amplify falsehoods. By the third week after his father's death, Ishmael had created a mental dossier of the world he would need to infiltrate. He knew that to bring Evan down he would need not only intelligence but also the perfect disguise. The quiet, awkward teenager he had become was no longer an act. It was a shield, a cloak that allowed him to study the machine from within without triggering suspicion. He also began internalizing the cost of patience. Revenge, he realized, was measured in years. It required understanding, observation, and strategic restraint. One false move, one hint that he knew more than he appeared to, could destroy him. And yet, the stakes were undeniable. The death of his father, the destruction of his family, and the unchecked predation of a man like Evan Cross. He could not act impulsively. In the background, Evan continued his relentless pursuit of virality. New stories, new targets, and a growing ego made him untouchable in his own eyes. He didn't notice the boy cataloging his every habit, predicting his movements, and understanding his manipulations before they were executed. Ishmael knew every angle, every potential leverage point. The predator had no idea he was being studied. It was during this time that Ishmael first realized the subtle truth about power. People reveal everything when they think no one is paying attention. Weaknesses, desires, inconsistencies, they are all visible to someone willing to observe. And Ishmael, invisible to the world, had the patience to see it all. He began identifying patterns, calculating probabilities, and mentally rehearsing interventions. Every misstep Evan made, every digital trail he left, became a weapon. Every system he relied on was a potential vulnerability. Ishmael had evolved. No longer just a grieving boy, no longer merely invisible, he had become a strategist, a silent observer, a mind preparing for action. The foundation was complete. The mask was perfected. And the storm, slow and deliberate, was beginning to form. The weeks stretched into a rhythm of observation and preparation. Ishmael moved through the world as both ghost and scholar, invisible to all, yet acutely aware of everything. He cataloged patterns, predicted behavior, and refined his persona. Every misstep, every stumble, every awkward question reinforced the narrative that the world would never see the danger behind his quiet eyes. And danger there was. Ishmael's grief had sharpened into something precise, surgical, and unstoppable. He understood now that revenge wasn't anger, it was design. The system that had killed his father was bigger than one man, bigger than one office, and bigger than one headline. To dismantle it, he had to think like it, move like it, and blend into it without detection. Miriam had become fragile, a shadow of the woman who once ran a hospital floor with authority and compassion. Her grief was raw, visible, and easily exploited. Ishmael studied her, but not with cruelty. He understood the stakes. The cost of inaction had already been measured in a life. He would not allow further loss. The lessons of observation extended to those he loved most. Survival meant adaptation, and adaptation demanded patience. One evening he observed Evan Cross on a livestream. The journalist, confident, smug, and completely unaware of the silent observer cataloging every nuance, praised himself for investigative brilliance. Every word, every gesture, every performance was a blueprint for manipulation. Ishmael memorized it all. The cadence, the inflection, and the theatrics designed to provoke outrage. The flaws, the moments of overconfidence, the slips, the tiny inconsistencies, were like cracks in stone, invisible to everyone else but visible to him. He understood that the system rewarded predators like Evan. It fed on outrage, on virality, on fear, on gossip, and on clicks. It didn't matter if the stories were true or false. The architecture of the machine amplified deception. And the machine was blind to those who studied it quietly, waiting for the perfect moment. Ishmael smiled faintly. Patience, after all, was invisible power. By now his full persona was flawless. Teachers, neighbors, and classmates all believed he was the slow, awkward boy, harmless and unremarkable. Ishmael had practiced every hesitation, every mispronounced word, and every clumsy action. He had rehearsed smiles, pauses, and questions that seemed painfully obvious. Every detail strengthened the illusion, and every illusion increased his freedom to observe without interference. In his bedroom, he created mental scenarios, simulations of every possible confrontation, leak, or revelation. How would Evan react if an internal email surfaced? What if a social media post contradicted one of his stories? How could one subtle shift unravel the entire facade? Ishmael ran the scenarios over and over, adjusting, refining, and memorizing the outcomes. The blueprint was taking shape. Then came a moment of unexpected clarity. He realized that invisibility wasn't just protection. It was leverage. People reveal their deepest truths when they believe no one is watching. And the entire system, editors, journalists, politicians, and manipulators, operated under the illusion that the quiet boy posed no threat. Ishmael's mind absorbed every nuance, every opportunity, and every weakness. He began to identify his first targets indirectly. Not Evan directly, he wasn't ready yet, but the network enabling him. Editors who failed to verify, interns who repeated falsehoods, and algorithms that promoted outrage. Each one was a node in the machinery that destroyed his father. Each one could be manipulated. And each one would be, in time. Ishmael's intelligence was not just academic. It was strategic. He recognized the patterns of human behavior and anticipated reactions before they occurred. Small tests reinforced his conclusions. A question asked at school revealed how quickly assumptions were made. A comment on social media demonstrated how outrage could be weaponized. Every tiny victory of observation confirmed that he could predict outcomes, even in a chaotic system. One night, he sat at his desk, staring at the pattern of digital footprints left by Evan Cross. Emails, social media posts, articles, comments, every digital trace meticulously stored, memorized and cross-referenced. Ishmael could predict the next headline, the next viral story, and the next scandalous accusation before anyone else even saw it. The system was predictable. It was manipulable. It could be dismantled. And that was the final piece. Observation, invisibility, patience, and strategy had converged. Ishmael understood that he could not confront Evan or the system directly. He had to infiltrate it, become part of it, move inside the machine while the world ignored him, the perfect disguise hiding an unstoppable intellect. The stage was set. The first small tests began subtly. He volunteered for extra tasks at school, not out of diligence but to study human behavior. He asked innocent questions in public forums, observing how authority figures reacted. He recorded patterns mentally, memorized details, and rehearsed contingencies for every possible scenario. The world continued to underestimate him, and that underestimation became his weapon. At home, he noticed Miriam's tentative attempts to reclaim normalcy. She smiled occasionally and tried to return to routines, but the weight of loss lingered. Ishmael allowed her small victories. But he also understood that the moment for action would require total commitment. Preparation meant patience, and patience required restraint, even from the grieving boy. He began compiling an internal ledger of names, dates, and incidents. Each one represented an opportunity for leverage or revelation. Teachers who spread rumors. Parents who believed false narratives. Editors who failed to fact-check. Every node in the network was a potential move in a game of strategy he would one day play to its conclusion. By the end of the first month after Daniel's death, Ishmael had evolved completely. No longer just the grieving boy, no longer merely invisible, he had become a strategist. His mind moved like a machine, calculating probabilities, memorizing sequences, and planning contingencies. The mask of mediocrity was perfected. The storm of observation was gathering quietly, inexorably. And then came the vow that would carry him through the next decade, whispered softly in the stillness of his room. One day you will see me. And when you do, there will be no hiding, no excuses, and no escape. You will face what you have built, and you will regret every life you destroyed, including my father's. It was a vow without anger, without hatred, and without panic. It was a vow of calculation, inevitability, and precision. And Ishmael understood, more clearly than ever, that the only way to honor it was to move carefully, invisibly, and with complete control. Baltimore County had returned to a semblance of calm, but it was a calm built on ignorance. Evan Cross continued his work, oblivious to the silent observer, cataloging every movement, predicting every response, and memorizing every detail. Miriam continued to move forward as best she could, unaware that her son was no longer just surviving grief but mastering it. And Ishmael had transformed into something unseen, unnoticed, and unstoppable. The stage was set for infiltration. The world thought they knew the quiet boy. They were wrong. The next act would test his patience, his intellect, and the mask he had perfected. Every observation, every calculated move, and every subtle act of invisibility would converge. And in that convergence, Evan Cross, and the system that enabled him, would begin to face a force they could not comprehend. Because the quiet ones remember everything. The invisible ones plan everything. And the ones who never speak, sometimes strike with precision so absolute that nothing survives in their path. And Ishmael Wright was ready. Ishmael Wright had a plan, and plans require patience, timing, and the perfect disguise. He had already mastered invisibility, but invisibility alone wasn't enough. To take down Evan Cross and the machinery that killed his father, he needed access to the newsroom, access to the inner workings, and access to the very engine of lies. And that meant infiltrating Evan's world without anyone noticing. It started small. Job applications submitted under his own name, carefully crafted to appear ordinary, unremarkable, and even slightly incompetent. Every resume, every cover letter deliberately designed to signal harmlessness. He didn't want attention. He wanted proximity. The closer he could get, the more he could observe. The response was predictable. Rejections. Laughter. Overlooked applications. But one stood out. Capital News Network, a mid-tier but politically influential outlet, needed a mailroom intern. The job was menial, underpaid, and invisible. Exactly the opportunity Ishmael sought. He walked into the building for the first time and felt the rhythm of the machine. Newsrooms move fast, frenetic energy, endless chatter, coffee-fueled typing, phone calls, and reporters yelling questions at editors. The chaos was intimidating, but Ishmael thrived in patterns. He scanned the room, memorized faces, recorded routines, and cataloged the unspoken hierarchy. Evan Cross was unmistakable. A force of charisma and arrogance, striding through the newsroom with the confidence of someone who believed the world existed solely to validate him. Ishmael watched him carefully, noting the micro-expressions, the gestures, and the predictable manipulations. Cross was a predator. But every predator leaves traces. Every predator has habits, weaknesses, and blind spots. Ishmael cataloged them all. His interview was brief. Evan barely looked at him. "You're slow," he said, smirking. "Not exactly what we need for investigative work." Ishmael froze, just enough to seem intimidated, fumbling over his words. I can, do the mail maybe?" Evan laughed. "Sure, kid. You can carry packages, fetch coffee, and pick up lunch. Just, don't slow anyone down." It was perfect. The world believed Ishmael was incompetent. And that belief was his shield. He entered the mailroom the next day, carrying packages, delivering envelopes, and running errands, invisible in plain sight. Nobody questioned him. Nobody watched him. Nobody suspected he was cataloging every password, every internal process, and every casual conversation like a silent observer in a war nobody else knew existed. The first few weeks were about learning. Patterns emerged. Editors always left their screens unlocked for 2 minutes when walking to meetings. Security cameras had blind spots at the corners of hallways. Reporters discussed stories openly when they thought no one was listening. Ishmael memorized it all. Every routine, every habit, and every small vulnerability was noted. And then came Alana Rivera. She was different. Young, sharp, and Latina, with a gaze that seemed to pierce through the fog of pretense most people relied on. She noticed Ishmael, the quiet boy in the mailroom, and something about him didn't add up. He moved awkwardly, asked dumb questions, and carried packages, all while watching everything. She didn't confront him. She didn't call him out. But she watched. For Ishmael, this was both a complication and an opportunity. He didn't trust easily. He had learned too young that trust could destroy a family, but Alana's presence was harmless for now. She didn't know, and she wasn't suspicious enough to interfere. Yet, he made mental notes of patterns of her behavior, the way she noticed things others didn't, and the way she interacted with the newsroom. She could be an ally or she could be a threat. Either way, he cataloged her. Observation led to understanding. And understanding led to preparation. Ishmael watched Evan craft narratives, manipulate interviews, and weaponize outrage. He memorized the tone of his emails, the cadence of his video segments, and the predictable escalation of each story from rumor to headline. Every detail of Evan's operation was a map for eventual exploitation. Ishmael's mind worked faster than anyone could imagine. While he delivered coffee, he calculated probabilities. While he ran errands, he reconstructed the sequence of every viral story Cross had produced. He could predict audience reaction, editorial adjustments, and even sponsor responses before they happened. The newsroom was a machine, and he was learning to operate every gear silently, invisibly. At night, he returned home and expanded the research. Deleted posts, edited videos, metadata buried in images, and offhand comments that revealed inconsistencies. He traced patterns from social media to internal memos. He reconstructed the hidden network supporting Evan Cross. Editors who looked the other way, PR teams who amplified narratives, and politicians who subtly nudged coverage. Every detail reinforced the size and fragility of the system. And then he began small interventions. First, anonymous corrections of minor errors in Evan's stories online. Tiny adjustments that went unnoticed but tested his ability to manipulate outcomes without exposure. He cataloged the reactions. Editors didn't notice. Viewers didn't notice. But the subtle shift was a proof of concept. He could influence events from within the machine, invisible, untouchable, and precise. Every day he refined his mask. Fumbling over words, dropping packages, and asking dumb questions. Every awkward laugh and every exaggerated pause reinforced the perception of harmlessness. No one suspected the boy cataloging everything and planning for the long game. Not a single person. And that invisibility became power. He also observed Evan's personal tendencies. Habits outside the office. Preferred coffee shops. Speech patterns during casual encounters. moments of overconfidence when he thought no one was watching. Each small observation was stored mentally, each flaw a potential lever. Ishmael knew that one day, this knowledge would give him control over the predator he had been preparing to dismantle since the day his father died. The first test of patience came unexpectedly. Evan Cross targeted a small local business, a black-owned bookstore, fabricating a scandal to generate clicks. Ishmael knew the damage that would be done, but he didn't act immediately. Patience was the weapon, invisibility the shield. He watched as the story spread, tracking the digital chain reaction, observing editorial adjustments and public responses. The business owner was blindsided, overwhelmed, and devastated. Ishmael cataloged the consequences silently, noting every misstep by the newsroom, every failure in the system, and every reaction from the public. Anger surged briefly, but it was controlled. He did not act yet. Acting too soon would expose him. Acting too soon would ruin the plan. He realized that fighting Evan directly was impossible. Confronting the journalist would only trigger retaliation, detection, and failure. The system itself, editors, algorithms, sponsors, social media, was designed to protect predators like Evan. To succeed, Ishmael had to become part of it, invisible, patient, and strategic. By the end of the first month at Capital News, Ishmael had achieved full integration. He knew the hierarchy. He memorized schedules. He identified vulnerabilities. He perfected his full persona. And he had begun to understand the true power of observation. Influence without detection. Alana continued to watch him. She noticed his quiet efficiency in cataloging patterns. She suspected intelligence but not yet the full scale. Her attention was a minor complication, but Ishmael cataloged that as well. Allies, threats, variables, everything mattered. And then came the first real leverage. A minor error in one of Evan's reports, an inconsistency that Ishmael spotted before anyone else. He submitted an anonymous correction internally. Editors acknowledged it, not knowing the source. The ripple effect was small but measurable. Ishmael realized the first truth of infiltration. Small, invisible nudges can produce consequences far beyond their size. The mask was working. The system was beginning to bend to him, subtly, without anyone knowing. Evan Cross continued to operate as if he were untouchable, unaware of the silent strategist cataloging every move, every flaw, and every opportunity. And Ishmael was readying the next phase. Patience. Observation. Invisibility. Precision. The world thought they knew the quiet boy in the mailroom. They didn't. He was already inside the beast. By the second month, Ishmael's integration was seamless. The mailroom was no longer just a workspace. It was his observation post, his intelligence hub. Every envelope, every delivery, and every idle conversation became a source of data. He memorized access codes glimpsed on screens, traced internal email patterns, and mapped relationships invisible to the casual observer. He learned which stories Evan favored and why. Not topics but emotional triggers. Outrage, pity, fear, and ambition, the levers that elicited maximum engagement. Ishmael could anticipate the exact phrasing Evan would use to manipulate viewers before the first word appeared on screen. Alana Rivera began to engage him indirectly. She asked minor technical questions. He answered cautiously, carefully balancing visibility and discretion. A wrong word could shatter the disguise. Yet, their interactions provided critical insight. Alana knew the system's weak points too, and Ishmael cataloged them, storing them for future coordination. The newsroom's rhythm revealed predictable flaws. Editors repeated the same verification shortcuts, relying on pattern recognition rather than actual fact-checking. Junior reporters recycled language from viral posts without cross-referencing. Algorithms promoted provocative headlines without contextual analysis. Ishmael noted each weakness, understanding exactly how to exploit it later. When Evan targeted another innocent, a young teacher accused of mismanaging grants, Ishmael monitored silently. The teacher's career teetered, fear rippled through social media, but Ishmael didn't act yet. Timing mattered. Influence was most effective when subtle, invisible, and cumulative. He marked every misstep, every editorial compromise, and every oversight in his mental ledger. Ishmael began experimenting with micromanipulation. He misdelivered one document, intentionally delayed a memo, and subtly rearranged schedules. Small acts with no immediate detection. Yet each nudged outcomes in predictable ways. He was learning the levers of control within the newsroom, understanding exactly how behavior, timing, and information flow intersected to produce influence. Security cameras were mapped. Blind spots cataloged. Key personnel routines memorized. Ishmael could predict when Evan would leave his office, which assistants would be away, and which reporters would bypass protocol. Every movement, every pattern, was a potential vector for evidence gathering or manipulation. One evening he began restoring deleted files from the office's digital archives. Shredded documents, archived emails, and misfiled reports, all reconstructed mentally and, where possible, digitally. Each piece of evidence revealed connections between Evan, political operatives, and offshore transactions. The scale of corruption was staggering. Ishmael cataloged it meticulously, noting which revelations would be most devastating once deployed. Alana, increasingly curious, noticed anomalies she couldn't explain. Minor inconsistencies in workflow, subtle disruptions in data flow, and uncanny timing of information appearing exactly when needed. Ishmael allowed her suspicions to exist but never confirmed them. The potential ally could accelerate his plan, but trust had to be earned slowly. Evan's personal arrogance became a liability. Ishmael tracked his habits outside the office: favorite cafes, patterns of social media engagement, and even predictable reactions to minor controversies. Every predictable behavior was a vulnerability. He cataloged it without emotion, purely analytically. Ishmael had achieved more than infiltration. He had operational control without detection. He could influence outcomes subtly, gather incriminating evidence, and predict human reactions with terrifying accuracy. The network that destroyed his family was beginning to reveal itself from within, piece by piece, and Ishmael stood ready to exploit it. The fool persona remained flawless. Every stammer, awkward gesture, and delayed response reinforced the illusion. Evan Cross never suspected. Colleagues laughed, overlooked, and dismissed him. He was invisible, and in invisibility he had power. The mailroom was no longer just a base of operations. It had become a command center. Ishmael Wright moved through it with the efficiency of a predator disguised as prey. Every envelope, every delivery, every casual conversation in the hallways was data, raw material to be parsed, analyzed, and weaponized. Evan Cross remained unaware. He walked through the newsroom like a king in a castle, convinced the world existed solely to validate him. He did not see the quiet boy who cataloged every expression, every slip, every opportunity. But Ishmael saw everything. The first real infiltration began with observation of routines beyond the office. Evan's schedule was precise and predictable. Coffee at the same cafe at 8:15, a quick check-in at a local gym, and social media posts timed for maximum engagement. Ishmael memorized the cadence of these behaviors, noting which minor provocations elicited emotional reactions. Every habit was a weakness. Every predictable move was leverage. He also began mapping interpersonal dynamics. Editors deferred to Evan instinctively. Interns repeated his talking points without verification. Producers anticipated his needs before he expressed them. Ishmael memorized every alignment, every dependence, every unspoken hierarchy. To dismantle Evan, he needed to know who would fall and in what order. Digital access became critical. Emails, internal chat logs, drafts of stories, he memorized everything. Passwords were reflected briefly on monitors, written on sticky notes that nobody noticed. Patterns in file storage revealed what Evan prioritized. Deleted drafts contained the fingerprints of manipulation and fabrication. Ishmael reconstructed the evidence in his mind, every detail cataloged with near-perfect precision. Alana's suspicions had grown. She asked innocuous questions about internal workflows, observing how Ishmael responded. He remained a master of invisibility, offering answers that seemed incomplete, hesitant, and uncertain. But internally he stored every insight she revealed. She could be an ally but only if approached carefully. Timing and trust mattered. Then came the first test of real infiltration: access to Evan's private cloud. The files were encrypted, layered, and meticulously hidden. Most would have failed. Ishmael visualized the encryption in his mind like a puzzle, identifying logical patterns, habitual behaviors, and default security settings. Hours of observation paid off. He bypassed digital locks without leaving a trace. Every folder, every draft, every deleted story became his domain for study. He found proof of financial transactions hidden offshore. Bribes funneled to support narrative fabrication. Politicians influenced through covert channels. Families destroyed by false reporting. The scale of the system was staggering, far larger than Ishmael had imagined. He cataloged it all, forming a mental map of power and vulnerability. Meanwhile, the newsroom continued its rhythm. Evan prepared a viral story accusing a local charity of embezzlement. Ishmael observed the preparation, memorizing every staged interaction, every fabricated quote, and every omitted detail. The mechanics of deception were laid bare before him. He began subtle interventions, small enough to remain invisible but enough to test influence. A minor misfile here, a mislabeled email there, and outcomes shifted slightly, but significantly. Ishmael's invisibility was absolute. Colleagues overlooked him completely, assuming he was slow, unremarkable, and distracted. His fool persona allowed him to move without scrutiny while he collected the knowledge necessary to manipulate the system. Every assumption others made about his incompetence became a tool for infiltration. He also studied Evan's emotional triggers. Anger at minor criticism, overconfidence when praised, and desperation to maintain virality at any cost. These insights were crucial. Manipulating behavior required precision. He began constructing scenarios mentally: a tweet misinterpreted, a video snippet edited, an internal email leaked. Each scenario predicted the chain reaction before it happened. By the end of the first week of active infiltration, Ishmael had done more than observe. He had begun to understand influence itself. Information, timing, and perception, all could be leveraged. He could provoke reactions without being seen. He could orchestrate outcomes invisibly, a ghost moving the pieces of a machine that thought it controlled him. Alana's presence became more prominent. She occasionally lingered near his workspace, curious, noting subtle behaviors she couldn't explain. Ishmael adjusted, feeding her partial truths while withholding his full scope. She could become an ally, and he stored this for future consideration. Then came the first opportunity for actionable disruption. Evan planned a smear campaign against a city council member to gain virality. Ishmael noticed flaws in the narrative: fabricated quotes, exaggerated context, and misrepresented statistics. He did not stop it outright. Patience was critical. Instead, he began recording the process silently, creating a mental and digital dossier of Evan's manipulations from inception to execution. The strategy was twofold: gather incriminating evidence and simultaneously prepare subtle sabotage. By the time the story would go live, Ishmael already knew how Evan would react to corrections, how colleagues would defend the falsehood, and how sponsors might respond to minor leaks. Every action was pre-calculated. He also tested his first direct manipulation. An innocuous email to an editor, phrased ambiguously, prompted a change in the narrative of the story. The adjustment seemed minor, imperceptible, but Ishmael anticipated the ripple effect. By the time the story hit social media, the narrative had already shifted in a subtle way that would undermine Evan's credibility without revealing the source. This was the moment Ishmael understood the power of infiltration fully. He could control outcomes silently, invisibly, without confrontation. The predator was unaware of the quiet strategist cataloging every step, memorizing every flaw, and predicting every response. Evan, meanwhile, continued to operate with arrogance. He scheduled interviews, posted on social media, and bragged about exclusive reporting that relied on fabricated evidence. Ishmael memorized every gesture, every inflection, every moment of overconfidence. The machine had exposed itself completely. Small victories accumulated. Minor errors were corrected preemptively. Tiny manipulations led to measurable changes in narrative impact. Ishmael documented each success, noting which techniques were most effective. The plan was expanding beyond observation into active control. Ishmael had achieved full infiltration. He was embedded in the system completely. He understood its vulnerabilities, mapped its hierarchy, identified its dependencies, and could predict human reactions with precision. The next step would be escalation: gathering hard evidence, manipulating Evan into exposing himself, and turning invisibility into leverage. The quiet boy in the mailroom had become a strategist inside a living, breathing machine of deception. And the machine, Evan Cross's newsroom, was still unaware that the predator it protected had already been infiltrated. Ishmael's world had shifted from observation to orchestration. The mailroom was no longer a passive post, it was a vantage point for control. Every action, every decision, every whispered conversation in the newsroom was a vector he could influence, subtly, invisibly, with absolute precision. The first major operation began with mapping Evan Cross's digital footprint in depth. Not just emails, drafts, and deleted files, but also private cloud storage, backups, and off-the-record communications. Ishmael reconstructed every sequence of Evan's past stories, identifying fabrication points, exaggerations, and intentional omissions. He built a mental map of corruption, offshore accounts, political backchannels, incentivized sources, all interconnected, all traceable. Alana Rivera began to shadow his work more closely, still suspicious, still cautious. Ishmael allowed her proximity. He fed her small, incomplete truths, carefully calculated to pique curiosity without compromising the operation. Her instincts were sharp, she could help. Or hinder. Either way, she became a variable he could track. The first opportunity to destabilize Evan emerged from a seemingly mundane story, a local nonprofit accused of embezzlement. Ishmael noticed that the data Evan relied upon was flawed, charts misinterpreted, quotes taken out of context, and financial records incomplete. Instead of immediate exposure, Ishmael executed a calculated intervention. He subtly rearranged files, shifted internal email timelines, and nudged junior editors into rechecking figures. By the time the story went live, the numbers had changed subtly. The narrative still appeared valid, yet tiny inconsistencies would later serve as evidence of fabrication. Evan Cross would not notice immediately. But Ishmael knew that over time, these small errors would compound, eroding trust, credibility, and perception. Next came surveillance of personal habits. Evan's overconfidence extended beyond the newsroom. Social media, text patterns, and predictable reactions to online commentary, each was cataloged. Ishmael memorized behavioral triggers, the exact conditions that would provoke overreaction. These were the levers for later manipulation. A misstep, a reaction, and a public display of ego that could be recorded and exploited. The mailroom became a control center. Packages, memos, and minor technical tasks were manipulated subtly to test responses. A misfile here, a delayed document there. Minor adjustments that produced measurable shifts. Editors adjusted stories, interns stumbled, and Evan unknowingly moved pieces on a board Ishmael was already controlling. He also began reconstructing shredded documents from office waste. Letters, memos, drafts, all were restored mentally piece by piece. The scale of corruption revealed itself. Bribes exchanged for fabricated stories, families destroyed by false allegations, and politically motivated manipulations designed to generate virality. Ishmael cataloged every connection, building a web of leverage. Then came the first real human test. Evan scheduled a high-profile interview intended to humiliate a local politician. Ishmael observed the setup meticulously, pre-written questions, staged reactions, and planted reporters in the audience. Every element was predictable, every reaction foreseeable. Ishmael planted minor errors in the lead-up, slight miscommunications, misfiled background data, and subtly shifted prep notes. He did not intervene openly. He did not disrupt visibly. But by the time the interview occurred, the politician's team had unintentional contradictions at hand, small but critical, undermining Evan's narrative. Ishmael documented everything, mentally noting what would later serve as incontrovertible proof of manipulation. This was the essence of his strategy: remain unseen while shaping outcomes, cataloging evidence for maximum impact. Each action was a step toward dismantling not just Evan, but the network of complicity surrounding him. Alana's presence became more pronounced. She began asking questions about inconsistencies she noticed in internal workflow, curious about the quiet boy orchestrating subtle changes. Ishmael answered selectively, careful to maintain his guise while storing her insights for future coordination. She could be a powerful ally, if the timing was right. The next stage involved direct digital infiltration. Passwords memorized from reflections, system shortcuts noted during errands, and casual observation of security protocols allowed Ishmael access to deeper internal networks. Drafts of unapproved stories, emails to political figures, and off-the-record recordings were cataloged. Each file was a weapon, each piece of evidence a card to be played at the right moment. Ishmael began constructing mental scenarios for exposure. He anticipated Evan's responses to each potential leak, predicting public reactions, editorial pushback, and social media fallout. By simulating these outcomes mentally, he created a strategy that was airtight. Every move measured, every reaction calculated, every risk mitigated. The first covert manipulation occurred when Evan's team prepared a smear against a nonprofit founder. Ishmael subtly altered supporting documents, ensuring that when the story went live, contradictions would later surface, undermining credibility. He recorded internal discussions, capturing Evan's casual disregard for accuracy. It was not public yet, but the dominoes were set. Each success reinforced the mask. The newsroom saw only the awkward, fumbling in turn. They did not notice the strategist quietly reshaping outcomes from behind the scenes. Every assumption about incompetence strengthened his invisibility, increasing leverage and reducing risk. Then came the first major internal crisis. Evan prepared to fabricate a story about a local family, falsely accusing them of financial misconduct. Ishmael identified every flaw in advance. He reconstructed the narrative mentally, mapped internal approvals, and anticipated the digital footprint of the story once published. Instead of stopping it, he collected evidence, emails, chats, drafts, and metadata. The family's impending damage was tragic, but the eventual payoff was precision. Evidence that could not be denied, exposed without revealing his identity. Ishmael also began subtle psychological manipulation. Anonymous tips, minor leaks, and timing adjustments, all designed to provoke micro-reactions in Evan. A wrong email forwarded to the wrong assistant, a minor miscommunication about a story deadline, small triggers that would later compound. By influencing behavior invisibly, Ishmael ensured that the environment was shaped to reveal Evan's flaws organically, without any suspicion of outside interference. Ishmael had transformed the newsroom into a controlled ecosystem. Every interaction, every story, every document, and every reaction was cataloged and anticipated. Evan Cross remained unaware, confident in his own brilliance. The quiet boy in the mailroom was no longer just observing. He was orchestrating, manipulating, and preparing. The network of lies that had destroyed his father was beginning to unravel from the inside, thread by thread. And yet, Ishmael remained patient. The ultimate strike had not yet arrived. Every action, every micromanipulation, and every piece of evidence was being stored, sequenced, and timed for maximum impact. He knew that the day of reckoning would come, and when it did, it would be absolute. The fool was invisible. The genius was inside. And Evan Cross had no idea that the endgame had already begun. The newsroom had become a battlefield. Ishmael Wright was no longer simply an observer or an infiltrator. He was a strategist waging a war invisible to those around him. Every action, every whisper, every keystroke was a tactical maneuver, designed to weaken Evan Cross and the system that had destroyed his family. The first phase of the secret war began with evidence collection at scale. Ishmael restored shredded documents from trash bins, pieced together deleted drafts from internal drives, and cross-referenced emails, messages, and metadata. Every shred of information revealed a chain of corruption, manipulation, and cruelty. Offshore accounts, bribes to reporters, false narratives crafted to ruin innocent families. Every connection, every transaction, and every misdeed was meticulously catalogued. He did not stop there. Surveillance extended beyond the newsroom. Evan's movements, habits, and interactions outside work were monitored and memorized. Coffee shops, gyms, casual meetings, social media activity, everything predictable, everything exploitable. Ishmael cataloged not just data but also human behavior. Overconfidence, impatience, and ego-driven decisions. All were weaknesses he would exploit later. Alana Rivera became increasingly present, asking questions about anomalies she noticed in internal workflow. Ishmael remained cautious. He fed her selective truths, enough to pique curiosity, but never enough to compromise his operation. Timing mattered. Trust had to be earned. She could become an invaluable ally, but only if approached with precision. Meanwhile, Evan prepared his next story, a politically motivated attack on a small black-owned business. Ishmael observed each step. Drafts, interviews, narrative framing, data selection. Nothing went unnoticed. He cataloged every flaw, every inconsistency, and every ethical breach. Patience remained critical. Ishmael did not act openly. He allowed the story to progress, gathering evidence silently. Each misstep by Evan added to the dossier he was constructing: emails, internal communications, off-the-record conversations, metadata traces, and video drafts. The chain of wrongdoing was growing into an undeniable web of proof. The first active intervention occurred subtly. Ishmael manipulated the flow of information, delaying certain internal memos and misdirecting drafts to specific editors. Outcomes shifted slightly but meaningfully. The story would reach the public, but its flaws would become evidence later. Every micro-adjustment reinforced Ishmael's control while remaining invisible. Alana's role expanded. She noticed the anomalies he introduced and began asking deeper questions. Ishmael carefully maintained his fool persona while subtly guiding her attention to certain weak points, enough to later coordinate evidence extraction without compromising the mission. As the war escalated, Ishmael began recording interactions covertly. Conversations between Evan and editors, private meetings with political operatives, offhand discussions about fabricated stories, every word captured, every gesture memorized. He cataloged patterns in behavior, predictable responses to minor disruptions, and the exact moments when Evan's overconfidence exposed him to risk. Digital infiltration intensified. Passwords memorized from reflections, sticky notes, and overlooked internal files allowed Ishmael access to confidential communications, story drafts, and deleted documents. He mapped the entire network of influence, from junior reporters to political actors, understanding how information flowed and how power was exercised. The first targeted manipulation occurred when Evan attempted to fabricate a story against a teacher falsely accused of embezzlement. Ishmael altered key data points subtly, ensuring internal contradictions. He recorded Evan's discussions, capturing every instance of casual dishonesty and disregard for truth. The teacher remained unaware, but Ishmael's dossier expanded with precision. The second manipulation targeted a minor editor known for overconfidence. Ishmael sent ambiguous internal messages, prompting the editor to misplace a memo critical to Evan's next story. The resulting confusion shifted the narrative subtly, creating inconsistencies that would later undermine Evan's credibility. Every intervention was calculated. The key principle was invisibility: manipulate without exposure. Each subtle action produced measurable consequences, all while Evan remained oblivious. Ishmael's fool persona acted as armor, hiding his intellect while allowing him to control outcomes. The war extended to psychological operations. Ishmael exploited Evan's ego and predictable reactions to stress. Small leaks, misdirected emails, and timing adjustments created micro-anxieties in Evan, pushing him toward mistakes. Each reaction was cataloged, recorded, and stored for future use. Alana became a silent observer, increasingly intrigued by the pattern of anomalies. Ishmael maintained distance, letting her curiosity grow without revealing the full scale of his operation. Her presence added a new variable, potentially powerful, potentially risky, but one he could manage through careful timing and selective disclosure. Ishmael's influence was undeniable. He could subtly alter stories, misdirect communications, and manipulate behavior across the newsroom. The machine that had destroyed his family was bending under his invisible hand, yet Evan remained unaware of the strategist in his midst. The first high-stakes opportunity presented itself when Evan planned a smear campaign against a community activist. Ishmael identified multiple flaws in the narrative: fabricated quotes, exaggerated context, and misrepresented evidence. He did not confront Evan or halt the campaign directly. Instead, he planted small discrepancies, minor edits, shuffled memos, and delayed communications. By the time the story was prepared for publication, the discrepancies were embedded. They were subtle, imperceptible at first glance, yet they would later provide undeniable proof of fabrication. Ishmael recorded every step, memorized every detail, and cataloged every potential exposure point. The chain reaction was set. Ishmael also began monitoring internal accountability mechanisms. Editors, producers, and junior reporters were predictable. They relied on shortcuts, assumptions, and patterns rather than true verification. Ishmael exploited these tendencies, nudging outcomes without leaving traces, ensuring that eventual exposure would appear undeniable yet untraceable to him. Alana's curiosity grew. She began observing how Ishmael navigated the newsroom, noting patterns in his seemingly mundane tasks. Ishmael continued to feed selective truths, guiding her awareness toward critical weak points while preserving his full invisibility. Her eventual trust could become an asset for orchestrating evidence extraction and public exposure. The war intensified outside the office as well. Evan's social media campaigns, public appearances, and digital manipulations were all tracked. Ishmael memorized audience reactions, sponsor responses, and the timing of viral spikes. Every element of perception, influence, and public manipulation was cataloged, stored, and analyzed. Ishmael had established full operational control within the newsroom. Every internal process, every human interaction, and every digital footprint was under observation. He had begun subtle manipulations, crafted a detailed dossier of wrongdoing, and identified critical vulnerabilities in Evan Cross's network. The quiet boy in the mailroom was no longer merely invisible. He was a strategist, a manipulator, and a tactician conducting a silent war. Every microaction, every recorded observation, and every psychological trigger was a step toward ultimate exposure. Evan Cross remained oblivious. But the battlefield was set. Ishmael was inside the engine of lies, the architect of future collapse, and the silent orchestrator of revenge that no one would see coming. The war had escalated. Ishmael Wright moved through the newsroom like a ghost, unseen yet omnipresent. Every keystroke, every misfiled memo, and every whispered correction was calculated, a tiny lever shifting the entire machinery toward inevitable exposure. He began a new phase, simultaneous operations across multiple fronts. While the newsroom worked on daily stories, Ishmael executed covert digital extractions, emails revealing bribes, off-the-record recordings of Evan mocking victims, and drafts showing deliberate narrative manipulation. Nothing was overlooked. Every piece of information was cataloged and cross-referenced, forming a web of irrefutable evidence. Physical surveillance complemented the digital. Ishmael noted Evan's meetings outside the office, casual interactions with sources, and even gestures during casual lunches that revealed patterns of deceit. Each observation was mapped against the digital network, linking people, timelines, and motivations into a comprehensive control map. The first active strike occurred quietly. Ishmael subtly delayed a critical memo intended for a junior editor, causing minor inconsistencies in a story about a charity scandal. On the surface, it appeared accidental. In reality, it forced Evan into improvisation, revealing his reliance on unverified sources and exposing cracks in the system. Ishmael documented it all. Alana Rivera grew bolder, probing anomalies she could not explain. Ishmael allowed it, guiding her attention selectively, training her indirectly to recognize vulnerabilities in the network without revealing his full scope. Her curiosity became a resource. Her observations amplified the reach of his influence. Evan's hubris began to show. He scheduled a high-profile televised segment targeting a non-profit leader, fully confident in the narrative he had crafted. Ishmael had already mapped the internal approvals, the drafts, and the social media push. He introduced subtle misalignments in the workflow, a minor file mislabeled, an email rerouted, a timing discrepancy. By the time the segment aired, the narrative contained internal contradictions invisible to the casual observer but lethal to anyone reviewing evidence after the fact. Simultaneously, Ishmael planted digital breadcrumbs designed to trigger internal audits. Slight metadata irregularities, minor inconsistencies in document edits, and suspicious deletions were strategically placed. The newsroom systems began to generate alerts, slowly tightening around Evan's operations without immediate detection. Ishmael also deployed psychological maneuvers. Anonymous tips, fabricated internal complaints, and subtle public nudges created tension. Evan, unaware of the invisible hand manipulating perception, began overreacting, micromanaging, and displaying ego-driven errors. Each misstep was cataloged, a puzzle piece in the larger mosaic of eventual collapse. The operation escalated further when Evan targeted another innocent, a small black-owned bookstore falsely accused of financial misconduct. Ishmael did not prevent the attack directly. Instead, he collected exhaustive evidence, emails, drafts, offhand remarks, and digital logs. He subtly influenced the story's framing so that discrepancies would surface organically, creating future leverage for exposure. In parallel, Ishmael began assembling the digital arsenal for maximum impact. Cloud storage mirrored to his secure system, recordings cataloged and encrypted, and visual evidence reconstructed from partial files. The archive grew rapidly, a weaponized library of corruption, deceit, and ruin, all pointing to Evan Cross. Alana began connecting dots she could not yet explain. She noticed patterns of minor interventions, timing shifts, document inconsistencies, and perfectly targeted nudges. Ishmael maintained his fool persona, allowing her partial insight while keeping the full picture invisible. He recognized her value. With trust, she could help amplify his strategy. Without trust, she remained a risk. The next covert operation was audacious. Evan prepared a story attacking a teacher for alleged mismanagement of funds. Ishmael subtly disrupted communications between the research team and the newsroom, introducing minor inconsistencies in quotes and data. He recorded every internal conversation, every editorial adjustment, every offhand comment from Evan. By the time the story went live, contradictions were embedded, ready to be revealed later as proof of fabrication. Ishmael's manipulation extended to internal politics. He nudged junior editors into questioning assumptions, prompted subtle debates that caused misalignment in Evan's teams, and created pressure points that forced him to reveal his reliance on unverified, manipulated information. The newsroom began to wobble, unseen by the casual eye but entirely under Ishmael's invisible control. Even outside digital and newsroom manipulation, Ishmael tracked public perception. Social media responses, engagement spikes, and viral commentary were cataloged. Each reaction was mapped against Evan's decisions, identifying which behavioral triggers produced maximum disruption. The battlefield was no longer confined to the office. It extended into perception, influence, and reputation. Then came a decisive strike. Ishmael leaked anonymized internal inconsistencies to a secure platform, timing them to appear coincidentally as errors discovered by external fact-checkers. Minor at first, these anomalies compounded over days, sowing confusion and mistrust. Evan scrambled, attempting damage control without realizing the invisible architect guiding the dominoes. Simultaneously, Ishmael executed covert psychological nudges. He created artificial urgency, subtle ethical dilemmas, and minor social provocations that triggered predictable reactions from Evan. Each misstep was recorded, cross-referenced, and stored. By the end of the week, Evan's behavior showed visible cracks. Overconfidence, impulsive responses, and signs of stress that would later play into public exposure. Alana began noticing patterns that defied explanation. Ishmael guided her insight indirectly, letting her develop awareness without revealing himself. Her eventual role as ally was being primed, critical for the next phase: public exposure and evidence dissemination. The final move in this phase involved direct evidence consolidation. Ishmael reconstructed every story, every email, every draft, and every off-the-record comment into a single interconnected dossier. The web of corruption, manipulation, and personal destruction was complete. Every misstep, every unethical decision, every lie, compiled and ready for release when the timing was perfect. Ishmael had achieved complete operational dominance. The system that destroyed his father's life had been infiltrated, manipulated, and destabilized from within. Evan Cross remained unaware of the full scale of the threat. He could feel tension, errors, and inconsistencies mounting, but the strategist orchestrating the collapse was invisible. The war had been waged in silence, with precision, patience, and cunning. Ishmael had transformed invisibility into power, observation into strategy, and subtle manipulation into dominance. The battlefield was set. The pieces were in place. The invisible war was over. The next stage, the collapse of Evan Cross and the exposure of his network, was imminent. The first cracks appeared quietly. Evan Cross, the once untouchable king of headlines, felt it in his instincts before he could name it. Minor inconsistencies in stories, strange internal questions, unexpected delays, small disruptions invisible to most but mounting into a pattern that gnawed at his control. Ishmael Wright remained invisible. His presence in the newsroom went unnoticed. The slow intern, the awkward mailroom boy, the harmless observer, none of these masks had been penetrated. Yet he was everywhere, watching, cataloging, predicting, and nudging outcomes without leaving a trace. The predator that had destroyed his family was about to confront the consequences of underestimating the quietest mind in the room. The first public tremor occurred with a minor story. Evan attempted to discredit a local shelter with manipulated statistics and selective quotes. Ishmael had inserted subtle contradictions into the internal data flow. To the public, the story seemed consistent at first glance. But when social media reactions picked up and local fact-checkers started posting anomalies, cracks appeared. Engagement turned from outrage to doubt. A whisper of suspicion became a ripple, and the first domino fell. Inside the newsroom, confusion spread. Editors questioned their own work. Producers noticed files missing or misplaced. Evan's anger flared, visible to everyone, a storm contained only by his bravado. Ishmael recorded every gesture, every verbal outburst, every rushed decision. Each misstep was stored for later leverage. Then came the first direct strike. Ishmael leaked a carefully curated snippet of evidence. Evan accepting money to fabricate a story about homelessness for clicks. Not enough to ruin him entirely, but enough to trigger an internal audit. The network reacted defensively, sending compliance officers through digital trails, inspecting drafts, cross-referencing sources. Panic rippled subtly through the newsroom, yet Evan remained unaware of the invisible strategist orchestrating the chaos. Ishmael observed his reactions, cataloging every instinctive move. Evan's pride and ego were predictable. The man demanded immediate explanations, blamed subordinates, misdirected questions, and attempted to regain control. Each reaction left a digital and psychological footprint, precisely the evidence Ishmael needed for the final collapse. Alana Rivera began to notice anomalies she could no longer ignore. Minor misalignments in documents, emails that seemed slightly altered, and a pattern of perfectly timed disruptions. Ishmael allowed her partial insight, careful to reinforce trust without revealing the full picture. She was a key component in ensuring the impact of the exposure would be undeniable. As the week progressed, small, seemingly coincidental disruptions compounded. A minor video clip mislabeling, a transcript slightly edited, internal emails arriving out of order, all invisible to Evan's oversight but critical to the narrative Ishmael was weaving. Each tiny failure eroded Evan's perceived infallibility. The empire of control that had been built through arrogance and deception was starting to wobble. Ishmael prepared for the next stage. He orchestrated a scenario that would provoke Evan into self-exposure. A high-profile political gala was scheduled, a perfect public stage. Ishmael leaked precise information that suggested a competitor or protest would challenge Evan publicly. Evan's response would reveal character flaws, unfiltered arrogance, and uncalculated aggression. Timing was crucial. When the night arrived, Evan confronted the staged chaos as predicted. Cameras caught his reactions. Outbursts, misstatements, and erratic behavior, all predictable under the pressure Ishmael had engineered. Clips were recorded, time-stamped, and stored for digital release. Sponsors and stakeholders began noticing, subtly distancing themselves. Social media dissected every moment. The first public signs of collapse were visible. Ishmael had orchestrated not only internal failure but public vulnerability. The network, confident in its infallibility, was unprepared for a collapse originating from within. Evan's reputation was fracturing, yet he remained unaware of who, or what, was responsible. Meanwhile, micromanipulations continued. Emails redirected, memos slightly altered, internal documents shuffled. Each minor change triggered cascading effects in Evan's decision-making. He reacted impulsively, misjudging the consequences, each action accelerating the collapse. The invisible architect remained undetected. The first public narrative hit. Social media accounts anonymously releasing verified snippets of internal communications showing Evan fabricating a story for political gain. Public outrage erupted. Politicians publicly disavowed him. Colleagues began distancing themselves. Sponsors paused advertising. Evan's panic was visible on live streams, his ego unraveling under controlled pressure, exactly as Ishmael had anticipated. Ishmael ensured that each exposure built upon prior errors. The flow was precise. Small inconsistencies first, then corroborated evidence, then public humiliation. The collapse was not chaotic, it was engineered. Evan's hubris, impatience, and reliance on manipulation created predictable outcomes that Ishmael exploited systematically. The next wave involved internal accountability. Ishmael leaked key files, drafts of stories with fabricated quotes, emails coordinating off-the-record narratives, and recordings mocking innocent victims. These leaks were timed to appear as accidental discoveries, yet each one created pressure, confusion, and panic within the newsroom. Evan reacted predictably: defensiveness, aggression, and blame-shifting. Each reaction was catalogued, stored, and used to reinforce the impending downfall. Alana's insight became crucial. She began connecting the dots in ways Ishmael had anticipated. Minor hints, observed inconsistencies, and subtle patterns led her to suspect that the collapse was orchestrated with knowledge she could not yet fully access. Ishmael allowed her suspicions to grow without revealing himself, maintaining control of timing and narrative. As Evan's mistakes compounded, his public perception worsened. Clips of angry outbursts, contradictory statements, and flawed reporting spread across social media. Analysts dissected his patterns, exposing predictable biases, manipulations, and ethical lapses. Sponsors publicly condemned the behavior, while colleagues began internal investigations to protect themselves. Ishmael had transformed invisibility into influence, guiding a perfect domino chain that no one could see coming. The final internal strike in this phase involved direct sabotage of Evan's newsroom control. Key emails were delayed, memos misdirected, and internal approvals slowed systematically. Editors became frustrated, deadlines were missed, and Evan's authority visibly eroded. Panic replaced arrogance. Confidence was gone. The network that had once bowed to his ego now operated independently of his control, without his realizing the architect orchestrating the collapse. Evan was destabilized both publicly and internally. Minor missteps had compounded into visible cracks in credibility and authority. Social media, sponsors, colleagues, and even the public questioned him. The stage was set for Ishmael to escalate further, moving from subtle manipulation into decisive exposure, the beginning of the fall that would be undeniable, viral, and irreversible. Ishmael prepared the next phase. It would not be subtle. This was the first direct public strike. The dossier he had built over months, emails, drafts, recordings, internal memos, was organized, verified, and encrypted. The goal was maximum impact. Undeniable proof that Evan Cross had destroyed lives, fabricated stories, and manipulated the system for personal gain. Timing was everything. Ishmael coordinated leaks to coincide with moments of peak public attention. Minor viral incidents, trending topics, and high-traffic news cycles were identified. He ensured that each piece of evidence would be amplified naturally, without revealing the source. The first strike hit social media like a calculated storm. Anonymous accounts released clips of Evan manufacturing evidence, emails showing bribes, and recordings mocking victims, including Ishmael's father. The effect was immediate: trending hashtags, public outrage, and media commentary questioning credibility. Evan's attempts to control the narrative failed because every outlet referencing him relied on his own prior statements, now weaponized against him. Internally, the newsroom spiraled. Editors, producers, and assistants scrambled to verify the authenticity of leaks. Every workflow disruption, minor misplacement, or timing error engineered by Ishmael compounded into chaos. Evan tried to regain control, but the environment had been reshaped invisibly. He was fighting a battle orchestrated entirely from within by someone he thought powerless. Alana noticed patterns she could finally piece together. Partial insights aligned with the leaks, pointing to a strategist acting with precision. Ishmael maintained his persona, revealing only what was necessary to guide her understanding. Her eventual role as confidant and amplifier became critical for the final exposure phases. Evan's public collapse accelerated. Outbursts during live interviews, contradictory statements, and visible panic dominated news cycles. Sponsors withdrew, colleagues abandoned him, and political figures distanced themselves. Each public misstep had been anticipated and leveraged by Ishmael. The empire of influence crumbled systematically. Evan Cross had begun to unravel visibly. The invisible war had transformed into a public spectacle. Ishmael's careful orchestration, months of infiltration, observation, and manipulation, had achieved measurable collapse without revealing his hand. The mailroom boy remained unseen, unnoticed, and underestimated. But the quiet genius behind the fall had now achieved a visible victory. Evan Cross's influence was shattered, credibility questioned, and the network of lies destabilized. The next phase, total exposure and revenge, was inevitable. Neither name nor control. Social media erupted, sponsors fled, colleagues abandoned him, and the public demanded accountability. But the architect behind it all, the quiet boy in the mailroom, remained invisible, calculating the final act. Ishmael Wright had waited for the perfect alignment of timing, leverage, and impact. Months of infiltration, observation, and meticulous manipulation had brought him here. Every shred of evidence he had collected, emails, drafts, recordings, off-the-record conversations, financial trails, was now ready for release. Every injustice committed by Evan would be made undeniable. The operation began at 2 a.m., chosen deliberately. The hour when newsrooms were quiet, systems processed overnight updates, and social media quietly absorbed new trends. Ishmael activated the release sequence. 50 videos, meticulously edited but factual, demonstrating Evan's deliberate fabrications and manipulations. Dozens of emails exposing bribes, corruption, and political collusion. Internal memos revealing orchestrated attacks on innocent families. Recordings of Evan mocking Daniel Wright's death. Offshore account trails linking him to financial misconduct. Every detail, every lie, every unethical decision, fully documented and verifiable. The first wave hit social media like lightning. Hashtags exploded, hashtag Evan Cross exposed, hashtag truth over lies, hashtag accountability now. Within minutes, thousands of views turned into millions. Analysts dissected the clips, journalists referenced the leaks, and public outrage ignited. Political figures issued statements distancing themselves. Sponsors withdrew support. The network scrambled to control damage but lacked the evidence Ishmael had weaponized. Inside the newsroom, chaos erupted. Internal systems confirmed the authenticity of the leaks. Drafts, emails, and recordings matched internal records. Editors and producers realized the leaks could not be ignored, but the origin remained a mystery. Panic rippled, mismanagement compounded, and Evan Cross lost the ability to respond strategically. Alana Rivera observed in stunned realization. The pattern she had suspected was now undeniable. Ishmael's strategic genius, previously masked by innocence, had orchestrated a collapse both invisible and unstoppable. She had anticipated small interventions, but the scale of the reveal was unprecedented. Ishmael's careful planning, patience, and timing were now fully visible in the magnitude of public exposure. Evan Cross, desperate and broken, sought the source. Every familiar path led nowhere. Every ally had abandoned him. Every system he once controlled was compromised. In the dead of night, he tracked him to the mailroom, the one place he assumed held nothing of consequence. The confrontation was quiet, almost anticlimactic, yet electric. Evan stood before Ishmael, pleading, panicked, his veneer of arrogance stripped away. "Please, kid. I'll lose everything," Evan whispered, voice cracking. "You don't understand. I can fix this. Just help me. Please." Ishmael stood, calm and measured, the full mask finally removed. Every feature sharp, every gesture controlled, every word deliberate. He did not need to speak loudly, his presence carried authority. "You already did," Ishmael said softly. The words were simple, but they struck harder than any accusation. Every lie Evan had told, every life he had ruined, every injustice he had engineered, the reckoning was complete. Evan crumpled. Not physically but morally, psychologically, and publicly. He had no excuses left. No escape. No allies. No credibility. The empire he had built on deception and hubris was gone, dismantled by a mind he had underestimated. Ishmael allowed Evan a moment to comprehend the weight of the exposure. The social media storm was still live, with global attention focused on every detail of Evan's manipulations. The evidence was undeniable, corroborated by his own communications, recordings, and public actions. Alana arrived just as Evan broke. She had pieced together Ishmael's orchestration, understanding the meticulous planning, the patience, and the invisible hand guiding each step. Her eyes met his, a mix of awe, respect, and understanding. She no longer questioned who he was, she knew the truth. a genius executing justice with precision, unseen and unstoppable. Ishmael stepped back, surveying the aftermath. The collapse was systemic. The network, the narrative, the public perception. Every element manipulated flawlessly to reveal truth. He had dismantled not just Evan Cross but the machinery of deceit that had harmed countless families, including his own. The final step was exposure. Ishmael ensured the evidence reached independent journalists, fact-checkers, and legal authorities. The network could no longer suppress, spin, or distort. The truth spread uncontested, viral, and undeniable. Evan's public persona was destroyed. Legal investigations began. Professional ruin was imminent. Ishmael's satisfaction was not vindictive, it was precise. Justice had been served, truth restored, and promises fulfilled. His father's name would be cleared, the lives ruined by Evan's fabrications acknowledged, and accountability delivered at a scale no one could ignore. Evan remained on the floor of the mailroom, defeated, desperate, and utterly exposed. Ishmael looked at him, not with anger, not with malice, but with clarity. The work had been executed flawlessly. Every calculation, every manipulation, every patient step had led here. "You underestimated me," Ishmael said, voice calm. "You underestimated what patience, observation, and precision can do. You thought a fool was harmless. You were wrong." Evan had nothing to say. Words failed him. His fall was complete. Ishmael had orchestrated a collapse that was visible, viral, and irreversible. The final phase of the war was complete. Ishmael had delivered justice for his father, exposed systemic corruption, and ensured that Evan Cross could no longer manipulate, deceive, or harm with impunity. In the quiet aftermath, Ishmael returned to his calculations, cataloging the final sequences, confirming evidence, and ensuring the public record was undeniable. His persona would remain masked for now, his genius hidden behind the image of the harmless intern, until the world was ready to recognize the architect of truth. Alana, finally fully aware, approached him. She did not speak immediately. She only nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the precision, patience, and brilliance that had orchestrated one of the most thorough takedowns imaginable. Ishmael's eyes met hers, and in that moment, there was understanding. The work was complete, but the responsibility for truth and justice would continue. The reveal had been executed perfectly. The viral storm, public outrage, internal collapse, and undeniable evidence all converged in a single, unstoppable sequence. Evan Cross, the man who had destroyed families, ruined reputations, and spread lies for personal gain, was exposed, humiliated, and defeated. The genius who had played dumb, the son who had promised justice for his father, now stood victorious, not with vengeance, but with the precision of truth executed flawlessly. The storm had passed. The chaos, the viral outrage, the collapse of an empire built on lies, all of it had run its course. Evan Cross was gone from the headlines, his influence shattered, his reputation irreversibly tarnished. Legal investigations loomed. Sponsors had withdrawn, colleagues abandoned him, and public trust had evaporated. The world now knew the truth. Ishmael Wright returned to Maryland quietly. His father's home, once filled with laughter, then silenced by tragedy, now felt empty but charged with the weight of justice fulfilled. The house itself seemed to acknowledge the precision and patience it had taken to orchestrate everything. For Ishmael, this was not a celebration, it was a reckoning, a confirmation that his vow had been kept. He walked through the familiar rooms, remembering the morning light spilling over his father's desk, the subtle smile of his mother as she prepared breakfast, and the quiet focus of Daniel Wright as he planned the future. All of it lost to lies, arrogance, and the selfish ambition of a man named Evan Cross. Yet, Ishmael had restored balance, corrected the record, and ensured accountability. Alana Rivera arrived at the house, her presence calm and deliberate. She had seen the full extent of Ishmael's genius, the careful orchestration of a collapse invisible to all but the most observant mind. Her respect was evident, but so was her understanding of the weight carried by someone who had mastered patience, observation, and strategy in the pursuit of justice. "Who are you really?" she asked quietly. Ishmael paused. For months, he had hidden behind a mask of harmlessness, of foolishness, of invisibility. Now, fully revealed, he chose his words carefully. "A son who kept his promise," he said. Simple. True. Every action, every manipulation, Every calculated risk had been to fulfill that one vow, to honor his father's name, to restore justice, and to ensure that the truth was seen and remembered. The national narrative shifted rapidly. Daniel Wright's name was cleared. Reports, investigations, and public statements vindicated him fully. Foundations were established in his honor, aimed at protecting innocent families, preventing fabricated stories, and holding media accountable. Ishmael's orchestration had created systemic change, not merely personal revenge. Meanwhile, Evan Cross faced the consequences. Arrested for fraud, bribery, and obstruction of justice, his public humiliation was total. Sponsors refused to associate. Former colleagues testified against him. Every unethical action, meticulously recorded and documented, became a part of the permanent record. No argument, no claim, and no excuse could reverse the damage. The architect of his downfall had ensured permanence. Ishmael did not revel in the destruction of another human being. His satisfaction was measured and precise. The goal had never been vengeance for its own sake. It had been justice, restoration, and accountability. He had operated invisibly, strategically, and with complete control, ensuring that the system itself, the enabler of lies and manipulation, was exposed and corrected. Alana watched him, the weight of understanding settling in. She had seen the genius, the patience, and the foresight. And she had witnessed the moral precision with which Ishmael executed his plan. "You changed everything," she said softly. Ishmael nodded. Not arrogantly. Not triumphantly. Calmly. The truth had been restored. Lives ruined by deceit were acknowledged. Systems exploited for personal gain were corrected. And one promise, made years ago over a coffin, had been fulfilled. The final reflection came as Ishmael addressed the public for the first time. The press was briefed, interviews were conducted with select independent journalists, and a statement was prepared. In a country where lies travel faster than truth, it is never the loudest voice that carries justice. It is the quiet one who observes, who remembers, and who acts with precision. Today, truth has been restored and accountability has been ensured. The statement went viral not for sensationalism but for integrity. Ishmael's presence was still largely anonymous. The focus remained on justice, accountability, and the restoration of his father's name. In the quiet moments after the storm, Ishmael returned to his father's study. The desk, the books, the memories, they were his inheritance in every sense. He had proven that intellect, patience, and strategic observation could overcome arrogance, corruption, and cruelty. Alana remained nearby, a witness and ally, recognizing that the work of justice required precision, patience, and at times invisibility. The public would remember the collapse of Evan Cross, the viral storm of exposure, and the unmasking of a liar. Few would know the strategist behind it all. Fewer still would understand the mind that had orchestrated it. And Ishmael Wright? He remained quiet, calm, and unassuming, yet entirely unstoppable. The genius who had played dumb, the son who had kept his promise, had changed the world with patience, intellect, and moral precision. The final narration closed the story, not with triumph or vengeance, but with observation, insight, and reflection. In a country where lies travel faster than truth, never underestimate the quiet one, for he sees everything, and he remembers everything. The house was silent. Justice had been delivered. Truth had prevailed. The world was left to reckon with the consequences. And Ishmael Wright remained as he always had, watching, calculating, and ready for whatever injustice might rise next.